Accept the monster. You are. This is not a call to chaos, nor a license for cruelty. It is a confrontation with an ancient truth, that inside every human being lies something wild, dangerous, and unspoken. And the more we deny its existence, the more power it gains in the shadows of our psyche. We have been taught to chase purity, to be good, polite, productive, to keep our impulses in check and our darkness hidden. From childhood, we learn which emotions are acceptable and which are not. Anger is bad, jealousy is shameful, desire is dangerous. So we exile these parts of ourselves, stuffing them into mental basements and pretending they aren't there. But they are, and they do not disappear. They wait. This article is not about surrendering to the worst within you. It is about looking it in the eye. The monster is a symbol. Your anger, your envy, your lust, your hunger for power, your cruelty, your chaos. The parts you pretend aren't there. The parts society teaches you to suppress. But to suppress is not to transcend. In truth, what is not acknowledged does not vanish. It festers, leaks, or explodes. Every great spiritual and philosophical tradition has, in some way, wrestled with this paradox. How can we become whole if we reject part of who we are? How can we claim to be good if we have never faced our capacity for evil? The purpose of this essay is to explore that paradox. We will journey through mythology, philosophy, psychology, and personal introspection to understand the roots of our inner monstrosity, not to banish it, but to bring it into the light. Because it is only through honest confrontation that we become truly free. And perhaps in accepting the monster we are, we discover something deeper than virtue. We discover truth, and through truth, power. Long before psychology, long before philosophy even had a name, human beings told stories. These stories were how we made sense of the world. And at the center of many of them, there was a monster. Monsters have always lived in our myths, legends, and sacred texts. They weren't just creatures to be feared. They stood for something more, a part of ourselves that we couldn't fully understand or control, something ancient, wild, and alive inside us. Take the story of the Minotaur, a beast with the body of a man and the head of a bull, trapped in a maze beneath the city of Crete. The king who kept him hidden did so out of shame, and the people who lived above fed him sacrifices to keep him quiet. It's not hard to see the metaphor. The monster lives beneath the surface, buried in the dark, and we feed it pieces of ourselves just to keep it from rising. Then there's Medusa, whose gaze could turn people to stone. She didn't begin as a monster. She was made into one. Betrayed and transformed, her power became something to fear. But even in her monstrous form, she still held truth. The power of rage, especially a woman's rage, and how society chooses to punish it. In Norse mythology, there's Fenrir, the giant wolf who the gods feared so much that they chained him up as a pup. But Fenrir grew stronger. Eventually, he broke his bonds and brought destruction to the world. Again, we see the same pattern. Try to cage what you fear, and it only grows more dangerous. These myths weren't just scary bedtime stories. They were mirrors. They showed people their hidden fears, their buried desires, and the dangerous beauty of what they didn't want to face. The monster wasn't always evil. Sometimes it was misunderstood, sometimes it was a warning, sometimes it was even sacred. In Hindu tradition, there's the goddess Kali, who wears a necklace of skulls and dances on the body of her husband. To many, she looks terrifying, but Kali isn't evil. She destroys ego. She burns away lies. She's the part of the divine that isn't gentle, but is absolutely necessary. Without her, nothing real can grow. What these stories have in common is that they all deal with power. The power we try to hide, the power we fear in others, and especially the power we fear in ourselves. Over time, cultures began to split the world more clearly into good and evil. Monsters became something to kill or cast out, but the oldest stories don't work that way. In those stories, the monster is a challenge, not just to the hero, but to the soul. To face the monster is to face yourself. And the lesson wasn't always to destroy it. Sometimes the hero has to understand it. Sometimes they even become it. In some versions of the werewolf legend, for example, the transformation is both a curse and a gift. The beast gives the human strength, freedom, and a raw kind of honesty, but only if the human learns how to handle it. This idea shows up across many traditions. The monster is a force, and that force isn't purely bad. It depends on how you meet it. If you deny it, it turns against you. If you try to destroy it without knowing it, you lose something important. But if you face it with courage and respect, it can become an ally. These myths are ancient, but the message still matters. We all have something inside us that doesn't quite fit into polite society. Some wild instinct, some deep emotion, some urge we don't want to admit. And for most of history, we've been taught to shut it down, lock it away, pretend it's not there. But the old stories are wiser than that. They don't tell us to pretend, they tell us to look closely, to enter the maze, to meet the monster. Because that's where real transformation begins. The mythological monster is not just a creature of fear, it is a symbol of truth. It shows us what we are capable of, both the danger and the power. And if we want to live as whole human beings, we cannot afford to ignore that symbol. We have to learn from it. We have to listen. Because maybe the monster isn't there to destroy us. Maybe it's there to wake us up. Philosophy has always been a conversation between the head and the heart, between what we think we should be and what we know we are. And when it comes to the idea of the monster within, this struggle becomes even clearer. Every major thinker has had to deal with the tension between reason and instinct, order and chaos, mind and body. Let's start with Plato. He believed the soul had three parts: reason, spirit, and appetite. Reason was the wise ruler. Spirit was our drive and courage, and appetite, well, that's where the monster lived. Our cravings, our desires, our hunger for pleasure and power. Plato believed the job of reason was to keep appetite in check. If the appetites ruled, the soul became disordered, like a city without law. This idea shaped Western thought for thousands of years. The good person was the one who stayed in control, who used reason to quiet the chaos. But there's a cost to this view. It treats the wild parts of us as a problem, as something to tame. It doesn't ask why the appetite exists. It only wants to shut it down. Freud had a similar idea, but with different language. He saw the mind as a battle between three parts: the id, the ego, and the superego. The id is raw and wild. It wants what it wants: food, sex, pleasure, dominance, without rules or guilt. The superego is the inner judge, shaped by parents and culture. It tells you what's right and wrong, and the ego stands in the middle, trying to keep the peace. In Freud's world, the monster lives in the id. And once again, the goal is not to unleash it, but to manage it, to give it just enough without letting it take over. But the id isn't evil. It's just primitive. It holds our instincts. And sometimes it holds our truth. Now compare that to Nietzsche, who flipped the whole script. He didn't think the problem was too much desire. He thought the problem was too much denial. He believed that society, especially morality, had made people weak by cutting them off from their inner power. Nietzsche wrote about the will to power, this deep force inside us that wants to grow, to rise, to express itself fully. He saw traditional values like humility and meekness, not as virtues, but as ways of avoiding life's intensity. In his eyes, the monster was actually closer to our true self, and to reject it was to become sick, bitter, and small. He even gave us a warning: be careful when you fight monsters, lest you become one. But he also added, and if you gaze long into the abyss, The abyss gazes also into you. Nietzsche wasn't saying we should act like monsters. He was saying we should face the truth of what we are, because only then can we choose what to do with that truth. The ancient Stoics had a different take. They believed that emotions were not monsters, but mistakes. To them, emotions like anger, fear, and jealousy came from false beliefs. If you wanted to be free, you had to think clearly. You had to train your mind to see what mattered and what didn't. When you did, the emotions lost their grip. But here's where Stoicism falls short. It can sometimes turn us into cold, quiet machines. It teaches control, but not always compassion, for ourselves or our impulses. It can make the inner monster feel like a failure instead of a fact of life. So what do we do with all of this? Plato wants us to rule our hunger. Freud wants us to balance it. Nietzsche wants us to embrace it. And the Stoics want us to reason it away. All of them see the monster differently. Some fear it, some respect it, some even admire it. But maybe the most useful thing we can take from these thinkers is this. Every philosophy of the self must wrestle with the parts of us that don't fit neatly into reason. You can't think your way out of being human. You can't argue your instincts into silence. And pretending to be purely rational only hides the mess. It doesn't clean it up. The truth is, we are not just logic. We are fire and blood and memory. We are shaped by survival, by trauma, by desire. And while reason is a powerful tool, it is not a complete picture. It can guide us, but it cannot erase the chaos inside us. And here's the deeper insight. Maybe we shouldn't want it to. Our instincts, even the ones that scare us, often come from something real. Anger comes from a sense of injustice. Jealousy comes from a hunger for love or recognition. Even cruelty can come from old wounds. These emotions, while dangerous, carry information. They point to what we care about. They show us where we've been hurt or where we feel powerless. If we listen, if we're honest, we can learn from them. And this is where modern thought is beginning to shift. It's no longer just about mastering the monster with reason. It's about building a relationship with it. It's about creating space for instinct and insight to live side by side. Because the monster doesn't go away when you ignore it. It just gets louder in the dark. So maybe the goal isn't to conquer the monster. Maybe the goal is to speak to it, to understand it, to ask what it needs, and to find a way to walk forward, together. In modern psychology, the monster has a different name. It's often called the shadow, the part of ourselves we push away, deny, or try to forget. But just because we hide it doesn't mean it disappears. Carl Jung, one of the most influential thinkers in psychology, believed that every person carries a shadow, not just people with trauma or dark pasts or violent tendencies. Everyone. The shadow is made of the parts we reject. Our jealousy, our selfishness, our rage, our shame. These parts don't go away when we ignore them. They slip into the unconscious and live there, just out of reach. Jung said something powerful. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. In other words, if you don't face the monster, it will control you without you even knowing it. You see this all the time in everyday life. A person who says they're never angry, but explodes in road rage or lashes out online. Someone who says they're always kind, but secretly judges others or gossips to feel superior. These are signs of a shadow acting in disguise. We also see it in bigger, more dangerous ways. When people deny their own dark impulses, they often project them onto others. They blame, scapegoat, or attack people who are different. It's easier to call someone else a monster than to admit there's one inside you too. But that's exactly where the real work begins, in owning it. In psychology, this is called integration. It means bringing the shadow into the light. Not to act on every impulse, but to understand it. Integration is not about becoming a worse version of yourself. It's about becoming more honest, more aware, more whole. Here's an example. Let's say someone feels a strong desire to control others. That's a scary thing to admit, so they deny it. But that desire doesn't go away. It just finds sneaky ways to show up. Maybe they manipulate people emotionally. Maybe they become passive-aggressive. Maybe they overhelp others just to feel important. Now imagine that same person recognizes their need for control and says, "Yes, I want to feel powerful. I want to feel like I matter." Suddenly they have a choice. They can use that energy to lead with integrity, to take responsibility, to become someone others trust, not out of fear, but out of strength. That's integration. Modern therapy, especially Jungian analysis, internal family systems, and then shadow work, often invites people to meet their monster directly. These approaches encourage people to ask hard questions. What do I hate in others that might live in me? What parts of me have I been told are unacceptable? What do I feel ashamed of, but still secretly crave? These questions aren't easy. They're uncomfortable on purpose. Because growth doesn't come from comfort. It comes from contact with the parts of yourself you've been avoiding. This doesn't mean all impulses are good. It doesn't mean you should act on every desire. But it does mean that the first step to change is awareness. You can't change what you won't admit. And you can't choose a better path if you're still lying about where you're starting from. Integration also helps with compassion. Once you've met your own monster, you stop pretending you're better than everyone else. You start to see other people more clearly, not as saints or villains, but as whole, struggling humans. That doesn't mean you excuse harmful behavior. It means you understand where it might come from, and you respond with both boundaries and empathy. In truth, many of the things we fear most, addiction, violence, cruelty, self-sabotage, often grow from repression, not expression. When you bury your anger, it turns into depression. When you deny your envy, it can become sabotage. When you pretend to be pure, you become dishonest, first with others, then with yourself. But when you face the monster and say, "I see you," something shifts. The monster doesn't disappear, but it doesn't need to hide anymore. It can be part of you, not in control, but not in exile either. And here's what surprises people the most. The monster, once understood, is often not as evil as it seemed. Sometimes it's just a younger version of you, still carrying pain. Sometimes it's a part of you that wanted love but never got it. Sometimes it's the fire you need to fight for yourself or protect others, but it's been misused or ignored for too long. Psychology doesn't ask you to become a monster. It asks you to stop pretending you're not one. Because that's where healing begins, not in perfection, but in truth. The goal isn't to tame yourself into a quiet life. The goal is to know who you are deeply and to choose your actions with full awareness. That is the power of integration. That is what it means to accept the monster you are. Let's be clear about one thing. Accepting the monster you are doesn't mean giving it the keys to your life. It doesn't mean justifying cruelty, acting without conscience, or using pain as an excuse. What it does mean is choosing honesty over illusion. It means seeing the darker parts of yourself, not with shame, but with courage. There's a kind of strength that most people never talk about. It's not the strength of being perfect. It's not the strength of having everything under control. It's the strength of knowing exactly what you're capable of and choosing to act with integrity anyway. That's real power. We often think that being good means never having a dark thought, never feeling anger, never wanting more than we're allowed to have. But that's not goodness. That's just denial. Real goodness only means something when you have the option to choose otherwise. Let's look at someone who understands their own capacity for harm. They know how sharp their words can be. They know they're capable of manipulation or violence or selfishness. But instead of pretending those things aren't there, they take responsibility for them. They stay aware. They don't act on every impulse, not because they're scared of themselves, but because they've built discipline through self-knowledge. That's someone who can be trusted. Not because they're nice, but because they're awake. This is where the monster becomes your teacher. Not your master, not your enemy, your teacher. When you listen to your inner darkness, you begin to understand your boundaries better. You start to see where your pride lives, where your wounds are, where you've been trying to prove something or protect yourself for too long. The monster shows you what's unfinished. Maybe your anger isn't random, it's about betrayal you never processed. Maybe your need to dominate others is really a defense against feeling powerless. Maybe the part of you that lies is terrified of rejection. These aren't excuses, they're clues. The monster is not chaos for chaos's sake. It's a message. But you have to be willing to sit with it and not look away. Friedrich Nietzsche called this idea amor fati, the love of one's fate. Not just acceptance, but love. Love even for the hard parts, the ugly parts, the parts you wish were different, because all of it is you. And when you love your whole self, you stop wasting energy pretending to be someone you're not. You start using that energy to build something real. This kind of acceptance doesn't make you soft, it actually makes you stronger. Think about it. When you stop being afraid of your own impulses, they lose their grip on you. When you stop hiding from your envy, you can finally understand what you truly desire. When you own your tendency to lash out, you can begin to pause, breathe, and choose a better response. This is why people who've done real inner work tend to feel solid, grounded. You can feel it when you talk to them. They're not pretending. They're not playing a part. They've made peace with who they are, including the parts that once scared them. And here's something else. Your monster isn't all bad. In fact, the traits you've been taught to fear often have gifts hidden inside them. Your anger might be the root of your courage. Your pride might hold the seed of your leadership. Your hunger might drive your creativity. Your darkness might carry the light you've been looking for. When we try to kill the monster, we risk killing something essential. Something that could be transformed instead of erased. Look at artists, writers, athletes, leaders. Many of them have learned to use their darkness, to turn their pain into beauty, their aggression into action, their chaos into motion. They didn't get there by pretending to be pure. They got there by turning toward what others run from. They learned to work with the monster. But here's the thing. Embracing your monster doesn't mean you always have to let it speak. It just means you don't lie to yourself about it anymore. You can look it in the eye. You can say, I see you. I know where you came from. I know what you want. And I'm still in charge. That's a different kind of strength. A quiet, grounded strength. Not the kind that tries to dominate the world, but the kind that can hold its own in the face of pain, failure, and fear. The kind that knows the full weight of the self and chooses to carry it with dignity. This is not about becoming fearless. It's about becoming fearless of yourself. When you stop being afraid of your own potential for destruction, you gain more freedom to build. When you stop running from your worst thoughts, they lose the power to shape your choices in secret. When you stop pretending you're only ever kind, good, or pure, you become real. And real people are far more powerful than perfect ones. So don't run from the monster. Don't try to destroy it. Learn from it. Grow with it. Let it sharpen you, test you, and make you whole. Because the goal is not to escape who you are. The goal is to become someone strong enough to carry all of it, with clarity, with courage, and with care. If we accept the monster within us, our aggression, our envy, our hunger for control, what happens to our sense of right and wrong? That's a real question. Maybe even the hardest one, because for most of us, morality has been linked to purity. To be good, we're told, we must be clean, gentle, controlled. But what if the opposite is true? What if true morality doesn't come from being harmless, but from being powerful and choosing not to harm? Let's take a hard look at that idea. Imagine a person who has never faced their own darkness. They've never admitted to themselves that they could lie, cheat, or hurt someone if the conditions were right. On the surface, they seem kind, gentle, pure. But deep down, there's a risk. Because if something pushes them far enough, if the pressure builds, they may act in ways that shock even themselves. Not because they're evil, but because they've never learned how to carry their full self. Now imagine someone else. This person knows they're capable of cruelty. They've felt the urge to manipulate, to lash out, to take revenge, but instead of hiding from those impulses, they've studied them. They've understood where they come from. And because they've faced them honestly, they know how to stop them. They've developed awareness, discipline, self-trust. Which person would you rather depend on in a crisis? Here's the paradox. The people most capable of doing harm are also the ones most capable of doing good, if they've chosen to understand their darker nature. Morality means more when it's not automatic. It means more when you've had the chance to be cruel and you still choose kindness. This idea shows up in great literature. In Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, the main character, Raskolnikov, believes he can commit murder and rise above morality because he sees himself as exceptional. But once he crosses the line, he's consumed by guilt. Not because society punishes him, but because something deeper inside him knows he's broken something sacred. His journey isn't about being punished. It's about waking up, about facing the truth of his own limits, his own responsibility. And in the end, his redemption only begins when he humbles himself, when he stops trying to be more than human, and finally accepts being human at all. We also see this in Hannah Arendt's idea of the banality of evil. She studied how ordinary people, not monsters, carried out horrific acts during the Holocaust. People who followed orders, people who didn't feel like they were doing anything wrong. What she found was chilling. The real danger wasn't monstrous cruelty. It was emptiness, a refusal to think, to feel, to reflect. Evil wasn't always loud and violent. Sometimes it was quiet, thoughtless, normal. That's why accepting your own darkness matters so much. If you don't face the monster within, you risk becoming part of someone else's nightmare without even realizing it. And so, can a monster be moral? The answer isn't simple, but it is honest, only if it chooses to be. Morality in this view isn't about having clean hands, it's about being conscious. It's about knowing the full range of what you could do and choosing the path that doesn't just protect yourself, but protects others too. This is not about guilt or shame. In fact, shame often makes things worse. When people feel ashamed of their darker instincts, they're more likely to hide them and more likely to act them out in secret. But when we bring those instincts into the open, when we examine them with honesty and care, we can guide them into something useful. For example, your aggression can become protection. Your hunger for power can become leadership. Your jealousy can point you toward your true desires and help you grow without bitterness. But only if you stay awake. Only if you're honest. Only if you're willing to carry the weight of knowing what you're capable of and still choosing compassion. Ethics, at its core, is not about perfection. It's about responsibility. It's about recognizing your impact, owning your choices, and learning how to live with both strength and softness. So yes, the monster can be moral, but not because it's tamed or erased, because it's seen, because it's understood, because it's given a place at the table, but not the throne. And maybe that's the truest kind of morality there is. The idea of a hidden monster inside us isn't just found in myths or psychology. It shows up in spiritual traditions too, though the language might be softer or more symbolic. In both Eastern and Western teachings, there's a long history of facing the darker parts of the self, not to destroy them, but to transform them. Let's start in the East. In Taoism, the universe is made up of opposites, yin and yang, light and dark, soft and hard, active and passive. These forces aren't enemies. They need each other. They create balance, and you've probably seen the yin-yang symbol, a swirl of black and white with a small dot of the opposite colour inside each half. That dot matters. It reminds us that even in light, there's a seed of darkness, and in darkness, a seed of light. Taoist wisdom says that trying to be all good or all pure throws things out of balance. It creates tension, even sickness. Instead, we're called to flow with the whole of who we are, to stop resisting the parts we find uncomfortable. In this view, your inner monster isn't something to be feared. It's something to be understood as part of the whole. Zen Buddhism takes a similar path, though more inward. Zen teaches that our thoughts, our emotions, even our sense of self, are not the problem. The problem is our attachment to them. When you feel anger, or fear, or desire, Zen doesn't say, get rid of that. It says, sit with it, watch it, let it pass through. In other words, don't fight the monster, just stop letting it drive the car. Buddhism also talks about hungry ghosts, beings with giant stomachs but tiny mouths. They represent people overwhelmed by craving, never able to feel full. It's a haunting image, but it's not meant to scare. It's meant to wake us up. When we ignore our deeper hunger, when we chase things mindlessly, we become like those ghosts, always searching, never satisfied. In these Eastern paths, there's no need to purify yourself before you can be at peace. Peace comes from seeing clearly, from accepting what is, even the monster. Now let's shift west. In Christianity, the language is different, but the themes are similar. Christian teachings often talk about sin, temptations, and the fallen self. There's a strong message about resisting evil, turning away from darkness. But beneath the surface, there's also something else, a call to grace, to forgiveness, to transformation. Take the story of Jesus in the wilderness. For 40 days, he's tempted by hunger, by power, by pride. But he doesn't run from the temptations. He faces them, he speaks to them, he holds steady. And when he returns, he's stronger, not because he never felt desire, but because he walked through it without being consumed. This story isn't about never being tempted. It's about staying grounded when the monster shows up. In Christian mysticism, you see even deeper echoes of this truth. Thinkers like Saint Teresa of Avila or Meister Eckhart wrote about facing spiritual darkness, not as punishment, but as part of the journey toward wholeness. They called it the dark night of the soul, a time when all light disappears, when faith feels lost, when you are stripped down to what's real. But here's the beauty. The dark night isn't the end. It's the doorway. It's where transformation happens. The monster doesn't block the path. The monster is the path. In Sufism, the mystical tradition of Islam, there's a teaching about the nafs, the lower self. The nafs is full of desire, pride, fear, and ego. But instead of being condemned, the nafs is something to refine. Through love, devotion, and deep inner work, the lower self is purified, not erased. The goal is not to kill the nafs, but to guide it toward the divine. One Sufi poet, Rumi, wrote, "The wound is the place where the light enters you." That's not just poetry, it's truth. The parts of us we think are broken may actually be the beginning of healing, if we have the courage to bring them to the light. Across all these traditions, we see the same idea in different forms. Wholeness doesn't come from denying the monster. It comes from walking with it. You don't need to be spotless to be spiritual. You don't need to be perfect to be at peace. What you need is presence, awareness, a willingness to stop running and start listening. Because in the end, the monster you fear may turn out to be the part of you that's been waiting to be loved. By now, the message is clear. The monster isn't your enemy. It's your responsibility. But theory only takes us so far. At some point, this work becomes personal. It becomes daily. It becomes real. So what does it actually mean to integrate your monster? It starts with honest awareness. You don't need to fix everything overnight. You just need to start noticing. What sets you off? When do you feel jealous or insecure or angry? What parts of yourself do you keep quiet around others? Instead of judging those reactions, get curious. Ask yourself, what's this part of me trying to protect? Often, behind the anger is pain. Behind the pride is fear. Behind the desire is a need you've been ignoring. Journaling can help. So can therapy. So can deep conversations with people you trust. The goal isn't to explain everything away, it's to listen. To create space for the shadow to speak without running the show. Creative work is another powerful tool. Art, music, poetry, movement, these can all express what words can't. Sometimes your monster doesn't want logic. It wants to be seen, felt, and moved through the body. Let it. Give it a voice, a shape, a song. Another practice is inner dialogue. Some people call this parts work. You imagine speaking directly to the hidden parts of yourself, the angry part, the sad part, the proud part. You ask what it needs, what it's afraid of, what it wants you to understand. It might sound strange at first, but this kind of inner listening builds trust. You stop treating parts of yourself like enemies and start forming a relationship with them. And through it all, self-compassion. This is not easy work. You will stumble. You will feel ashamed sometimes. You might wish you could go back to pretending, but don't. Stay with yourself. Forgive yourself. Learn. Because integration isn't about fixing what's broken. It's about remembering what's whole. You are not just your monster. You are the one who chooses what to do with it. That's where the power is. We began with a challenge. Accept the monster you are. Not as a slogan, not as a rebellion, but as an invitation to live fully, to live truthfully, to stop splitting yourself into good and bad, light and dark, and instead become someone whole. Wholeness doesn't mean you like every part of yourself. It doesn't mean you act on every impulse. It means you recognize that everything in you exists for a reason, and that maturity begins with making peace with reality. The monster inside you is not a design flaw. It's not a mistake. It's a mirror. It reflects what you haven't yet faced, what you were told to hide, what you've inherited, survived or denied. And like any mirror, it shows you what needs your attention. Not your punishment, your attention. The world is full of people pretending they're not angry, not afraid, not jealous, not cruel. But pretense is thin. It cracks under pressure. And when it does, it breaks trust with others and with yourself. But when you meet your inner chaos without flinching, when you learn to sit beside it, breathe with it, understand it, you gain something quiet but unshakable. Self-respect. Not for being flawless, but for being honest. Brave enough to look, strong enough to choose. This kind of person doesn't need to prove their goodness. They don't perform purity. They don't hide behind politeness. Instead, they move through life with a grounded presence. They know what they're capable of, and that's why their kindness means more. That's why their boundaries hold. That's why their love can be trusted. Because it's not coming from fear, it's coming from choice. There's a quiet beauty in that, not the polished beauty of perfection, but the wild, honest beauty of a soul that has faced itself and decided to grow anyway.